Writers, in this presentation, I share some thoughts about sentence types. If there's anyone out there who has a fear of grammar, I'm convinced that if you can get a firm grasp of these different sentence types, then you are in good shape and you're doing better than most. Once a writer knows the difference between the three sentence types, simple, compound, and complex, it is possible to write with sentence variety, and that's the idea. Sentence variety helps make your writing more interesting. Okay, so we begin with the simple sentence. It contains a subject and a verb. It expresses a single complete thought. A simple sentence is a single independent clause. Here's a sample. The cat crept through the dark house. Cat is the subject, crept is the verb. Expresses a complete thought. The wary mouse watched from underneath an upturned cereal box. Mouse is the subject, watched is the verb. The predatory cat stopped and surveyed his surroundings. So here we have two verbs, stopped and surveyed. One subject, cat. The mouse darted for the safety of the nearly invisible hole under the cabinet. Mouse is the subject, darted is the action. However, here's a caveat. We're still talking about a simple sentence, an independent clause. You might see instances where you have a compound subject. My uncle and aunt work for Microsoft. It's still a simple sentence. However, you have two subjects. This is important later, so you don't want to confuse this for a compound or a complex sentence. We're still looking at a simple sentence. A compound sentence contains two independent clauses. Okay, this is our second sentence type. We're still just talking about an independent clause. Eventually we're going to move on to dependent, but not yet. The two independent clauses can be joined in three different ways. The first and the most common and most important that I want you to grasp is by a comma and a coordinating conjunction, but also by a semicolon, and sometimes by a transitional expression also known as a conjunctive adverb. Joining two independent clauses by using a comma and a coordinating conjunction. So first you need to commit these to memory. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. Those are our coordinating conjunctions. The acronym FANBOYS is one way to remember these. Once again, before these coordinating conjunctions, you always want to insert a comma. So here's some examples. The cat was unsuccessful in his attempt to catch the mouse, comma, and the mouse was equally as unlucky in his attempt to get the cheese. We see an independent clause there, and then a comma and a coordinating conjunction, and another independent clause. The dog had watched all of this, comma, but he had refused to become involved. The mouse could wait until dark, comma, or he could risk a daylight raid on the pantry. The cat usually slept during the day, comma, yet curiosity held him at the corner of the kitchen. Coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or yet in these compound sentences. Using a semicolon to join two independent clauses. The cat was unsuccessful in his attempt to catch the mouse. Semicolon, the mouse was equally as unlucky in his attempt to get the cheese. So I'm showing the same examples we looked on the previous slide, except we're not using a coordinate conjunction. We're substituting them with a semicolon. All right, we're still talking about compound sentences. This is a third way that we can join two independent clauses by using a transitional expression to connect two independent clauses. When I say transitional expression, I essentially mean a conjunctive adverb. And here's a list of conjunctive adverbs. Here's some examples. Bob is handsome, semicolon, moreover, comma, he is rich. So notice the sentence begins with an independent clause, then it's followed by a semicolon, a conjunctive adverb, and then a comma, and then the rest of the independent clause. He is rich. So the conjunctive adverb only shows up in the second independent clause. It's not used in the first part. However, it can float around, it could begin in the beginning of the sentence, the middle, or the end. Bob is handsome, semicolon, he is, comma, moreover, comma, rich. Or at the end. Bob is handsome, semicolon, he is rich, comma, moreover, period. Here's another example. The cider tasted bitter, semicolon, however, comma, each of us drank a tall glass of it. The cider tasted bitter, each of us, however, drank a tall glass of it. The cider tasted bitter, each of us drank a tall glass of it, however. All right, now we're ready to move on to the third sentence type, which is referred to as complex sentences. A complex sentence is an independent clause joined by one or more dependent clauses. So now we're moving on to discuss dependent clauses as opposed to independent. A subordinating conjunction begins the dependent clauses. A dependent clause that begins a sentence must be followed by a comma. And lastly, a dependent clause has a subject and a verb but does not make sense on its own. This is probably a lot to swallow if you're new to this, so let me elaborate by giving an example. After he gave it some thought, the mouse decided to wait until later for his trek. So the first part of our sentence begins with a dependent clause. And remember, dependent clauses always begin with a subordinate conjunction. So the subordinate conjunction being used here is after. After he gave it some thought. Notice that is followed with a comma, because we're beginning the sentence with a dependent clause, the dependent clause must contain a comma. And it also doesn't make sense on its own. You couldn't say after he gave it some thought, period. These are subordinating conjunctions. You should commit these to memory. And some more sample complex sentences. Here the sentence begins with an independent clause. The cat fell asleep on the warm kitchen. You could put a period after kitchen, but then you continue with because. We know that that's a subordinate conjunction because he was deprived of sleep the night before. Independent clause followed with a dependent clause. Here we begin with a dependent clause and end with an independent clause. When is our subordinate conjunction. When the mouse heard the soft snoring of his sleepy nemesis, comma, he scurried to the pantry and grabbed enough food for a week. The dedicated feline sleuth keeps his nightly vigil. That's an independent clause, even though it shows us that that's a subordinate conjunction, so we know this is a dependent clause, even though the four-sided mouse will not be venturing out this week. And a fourth type is called compound complex sentences. So if you understand a compound sentence and a complex, this is kind of a blending of those types. A compound complex sentence is a sentence that has at least two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. The same subordinating conjunctions are used to introduce the dependent clauses. The same coordinating conjunctions, fanboys, are used for joining the independent clauses. Okay, so here's some examples. After the two adversaries had spent years playing this cat and mouse game, so we know that's a dependent clause because we're beginning with a subordinate conjunction after, and we know that we need to follow that with a comma because a dependent clause begins a sentence. They were joined by their children, that is an independent clause, and then we see comma and, that's a coordinating conjunction, so we know that an independent clause follows. So we We have a dependent clause, an independent clause, and then another independent clause. Even though it seems the two were bent on the other's destruction, so the same structure as the previous sentence, we're beginning with the dependent clause, the cat and mouse were rather fond of one another, and then coordinate conjunction, and neither wanted the other's defeat. This game was begun thousands of years ago, and it will continue far into the future as other cats and mice revel in hide and seek. So as is a subordinate conjunction, so the sentence ends with a dependent clause. Okay, let's test ourselves. First sentence, the teacher walked into the classroom, greeted the students, and took attendance. What type of sentence is this, do you think? It's a simple sentence. There's just one subject, teacher, and the teacher's doing three different things: walking, greeting, and taking attendance. Juan played football while Jane went shopping. This is a complex sentence. Juan played football is an independent clause, but it ends with while Jane went shopping. We know while is a subordinate conjunction. Juan played football, comma, yet Jim went shopping. This is a compound sentence because we see two independent clauses that are joined by a coordinate conjunction, comma, yet. Although Mexico has a better team, comma, they lost the tournament, comma, and their more aggressive style did not pay off. This is a compound complex sentence. It begins with a dependent clause. Although Mexico has a better team, it doesn't make sense by itself. It begins with a subordinate conjunction, although, and it is followed by two independent clauses. They lost the tournament, and then the coordinate conjunction, comma, and their more aggressive style did not pay off. The island was filled with many trails winding through the thick underbrush, small lake, and dangerous wild animals. That is a simple sentence, just one subject, the island, and it was filled with many different things: winding trails through a small lake and dangerous wild animals.